A loyal golden retriever waited at the same spot for 5 long years, hoping for his family to return. But one morning, something unbelievable happened. Something that left everyone speechless. In a small, peaceful town surrounded by green hills and tall trees, there lived a dog named Max Undersur. Max was not just any dog. He was a golden retriever with soft golden fur that shimmered in the sunlight. People often stopped to admire his beauty, but what truly set Max apart was his heart. He had a heart full of love and loyalty, qualities that made him unforgettable to those who knew him. However, Max's story wasn't a happy one. 5 years ago, something happened that changed his life forever. One sunny afternoon, Max's family, a kind couple and their young daughter, had taken him to the park. They tied him to a tree while they went inside a nearby store to buy ice cream. "We'll be right back," the little girl said, patting his head. But they never returned. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and weeks into years. Yet, Max stayed at that same tree, waiting patiently for the people he loved most. The townspeople noticed Max's unwavering dedication. Some brought him food. Others offered blankets during cold nights. But no matter how much kindness they showed, Max refused to leave the spot where his family had left him. His once shiny coat grew dull, his body thinner, and his eyes sadder. Still, he waited. Every morning, he would sit under the tree, scanning the horizon, hoping to see the faces he missed so deeply. Why did Max stay? Was it hope, love, or something else entirely? No one knew for sure. But everyone agreed on one thing. Max's story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. Something that would change Max's life forever. What was it? Let's find out. Winter had arrived in the small town, and the world seemed to freeze over. Snow covered the ground like a thick white blanket, muffling the sounds of footsteps and distant car engines. Trees stood bare, their branches reaching out into the gray sky as if begging for warmth. Under one of these trees sat Max, his golden fur now matted and dirty from years of living outside. His ribs were visible beneath his thin frame, a stark reminder of how much he had endured. Every day was the same for Max. He would wake up at dawn, stretch his stiff legs, and walk back to the tree where his family had left him. It didn't matter if it was snowing, raining, or blazing hot. Max never left that spot. Sometimes, children playing in the park would throw sticks for other dogs, laughing and shouting with joy. Max would watch them silently, his tail wagging faintly, but he never joined in. His eyes remained fixed on the road leading out of the park, waiting for the familiar car or the sound of running footsteps. One particularly cold morning, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper walked by with a bag of groceries. She saw Max sitting there, shivering in the biting wind. Her heart broke every time she looked at him. "Oh, Max," she said softly, kneeling beside him. She pulled a small piece of bread from her bag and handed it to him. Max sniffed it cautiously before eating it slowly, savoring each bite. "They'll come back someday, boy," Mrs. Harper whispered, patting his head. But even as she spoke, her voice cracked with sadness. She knew deep down that Max's family might never return. Still, she couldn't bring herself to take him away from the tree. It was his home now, or at least, the closest thing he had to one. As night fell, the temperature dropped even lower. Max curled up under the tree, trying to shield himself from the icy wind. His body trembled, but his eyes stayed open, scanning the dark streets. Suddenly, he heard footsteps crunching through the snow. His ears perked up, and his tail wagged weakly. Could it be them? Was this finally the moment he had waited so long for? The figure came closer, illuminated briefly by the glow of a street lamp. But as they stepped into view, Max's hopes sank. It wasn't his family, it was just another passerby, bundled up in a heavy coat, hurrying home to escape the cold. Max let out a soft whimper, his tail dropping to the ground. He rested his chin on his paws, his breath forming tiny clouds in the freezing air. Despite everything, the loneliness, the hunger, the endless nights, Max refused to give up. Every morning, he woke up with renewed hope, believing that today might be the day his family returned. And though the world around him grew colder and darker, Max's love for them burned brighter than ever. Spring arrived, bringing with it the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the gentle warmth of sunlight. The snow melted away, revealing patches of green grass that had been hidden for months. Birds chirped cheerfully in the trees, and children played happily in the park. But for Max, life remained much the same. He still sat under his tree every day, waiting patiently for the family he loved so deeply. One sunny afternoon, a young man named Ethan moved into the neighborhood. He was tall and lean, with kind eyes and a warm smile. On his first walk through the park, Ethan noticed Max sitting alone under the tree. At first, he thought Max belonged to someone nearby, but when he saw the dog's thin frame and matted fur, he realized something was wrong. Curious, Ethan approached cautiously, holding out his hand. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. Max looked up at him, his tail wagging faintly. Ethan knelt down and offered him a small piece of biscuit from his pocket. Max sniffed it before eating it eagerly. Over the next few days, Ethan made it a point to visit Max regularly. He brought food, fresh water, and even an old blanket to keep him warm during chilly nights. Each time Ethan came, Max greeted him with a wagging tail, though his gaze always drifted back to the road where he expected his family to appear. Ethan couldn't understand why Max refused to leave the tree. One evening, as he sat beside Max, he asked aloud, "Why do you stay here, boy? Don't you know they're not coming back?" Max tilted his head, as if trying to understand. Ethan sighed, running his fingers through Max's tangled fur. "You deserve so much more than this." The next day, Ethan decided to ask around about Max's story. He stopped two elderly neighbors who were chatting on a bench near the park. "Excuse me," he began hesitantly. "Do you know anything about the dog tied to that tree over there?" The women exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "Oh, that's Max. Poor thing has been waiting there for years. His family left him behind 5 years ago and never came back." 5 years? Ethan repeated, stunned. "Why hasn't anyone taken him in?" "Well," the other woman replied sadly, "he won't leave that spot. People have tried, but he always comes back. It's like he thinks they'll return someday." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to help Max, but how could he convince a dog to abandon the only thing keeping him going? That night, Ethan lay awake, thinking about Max. He imagined what it must feel like to wait so long for someone who might never come back. Yet, despite everything, Max's loyalty never wavered. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Over the following weeks, Ethan grew closer to Max. He brushed his fur until it shone again, fed him nutritious meals, and even taught him simple tricks to keep his mind active. But no matter how hard Ethan tried, Max wouldn't budge from his tree. Every morning, Ethan would find him sitting there, staring down the road with unwavering determination. Then one evening, as Ethan walked home after visiting Max, he heard whispers coming from a group of neighbors. They mentioned rumors about Max's family, how they had moved far away after a tragic accident. Ethan froze, his heart sinking. Could it be true? Had Max's family suffered too? If so, did that mean they weren't coming back? Torn between wanting to adopt Max and respecting his loyalty, Ethan didn't know what to do. All he could do was continue caring for Max while hoping for some kind of miracle. Little did he know, that miracle was closer than he thought. Summer arrived, bringing with it long, sunny days and warm evenings. But as the weeks passed, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and a strange stillness settled over the town. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity. Everyone knew a storm was coming. Max sat under his tree as usual, his golden fur now clean and shiny thanks to Ethan's care. Though he looked healthier than before, his eyes still carried the same sadness. He watched as people hurried past him, carrying umbrellas or rushing to get home before the rain started. Max didn't move. He never did. Ethan came by earlier that day, bringing Max a bowl of fresh water and a treat. "Looks like it's going to be a rough night," Ethan said, glancing at the darkening sky. He patted Max gently on the head. "Stay safe, okay?" Max wagged his tail in response but remained rooted to his spot. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and bending the branches of nearby trees. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Max whimpered softly, his ears flattening against his head. He had always been afraid of storms, but tonight, something felt different. The storm wasn't just outside, it seemed to mirror the turmoil inside him. The first drops of rain fell lightly at first, then turned into a downpour. Thunder roared louder, shaking the ground beneath Max's paws. Lightning struck a nearby tree, sending a branch crashing to the ground with a deafening crack. Max yelped in fear, pressing himself closer to the base of his tree. For the first time in 5 years, doubt crept into his mind. Should he stay here? Was this really where his family would find him? Just as another bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, headlights appeared in the distance. A car slowly drove along the wet road, its tires splashing through puddles. Max's heart raced. His tail wagged weakly, and he stood up, straining against the rope that tethered him to the tree. Could it be them? Was this finally the moment he had waited for? But as the car passed by without stopping, Max sank back down, defeated. Tears mixed with raindrops on his face as he realized it wasn't his family. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Max closed his eyes, trembling from both fear and exhaustion. He thought about all the lonely nights, the empty promises, and the countless times he had hoped only to be disappointed. Suddenly, there was a loud snap above him. Max opened his eyes just in time to see a large branch break free from the tree. It fell toward him with terrifying speed. Instinctively, Max leapt backward, pulling hard against the rope. The branch landed inches away from where he had been sitting, narrowly missing him. For a moment, Max froze, his body shaking violently. Then, something inside him snapped. Not the rope, but his resolve. After 5 long years of waiting, he finally understood. Staying here wasn't helping him or honoring his family. They wouldn't want him to suffer like this. With one last look at the tree, Max turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the storm. The storm raged on, its fury showing no signs of letting up. Max ran blindly through the rain-soaked streets, his paws splashing in puddles as he tried to escape the chaos behind him. But where could he go? For 5 years, his entire world had revolved around that tree. Now, without it, he felt lost, like a ship adrift in an endless ocean. Max eventually found shelter under the awning of a closed shop. He collapsed there, panting heavily, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. As he lay there, memories flooded his mind, happy ones this time. He remembered playing fetch with his family in the park, curling up next to the little girl on lazy afternoons, and feeling the warmth of their hugs. These thoughts brought both comfort and pain. They reminded him of what he had lost but also gave him strength. If his family truly loved him, they wouldn't want him to give up. Just then, headlights pierced through the curtain of rain. A car pulled over slowly, its tires screeching slightly against the wet road. Max lifted his head, too tired to react at first. Then, the car door opened, and a figure stepped out into the storm. It was a young woman, her face pale and streaked with tears. She wore a hooded jacket, which did little to shield her from the downpour. "Max?" she called out softly, her voice barely audible over the thunder. At first, Max didn't move. He stared at her, unsure if his weary eyes were playing tricks on him. But then, recognition dawned in his eyes. It was her, the little girl who used to laugh and play with him, now grown older. Her hair was longer, her features more mature, but her voice was exactly the same. Max let out a joyful bark, his tail wagging furiously despite his exhaustion. He scrambled to his feet and bolted toward her, slipping and sliding on the wet pavement. When he reached her, he jumped up, nearly knocking her over. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. Both of them cried uncontrollably, their sobs mingling with the sound of the rain. "I'm so sorry, Max," she whispered between tears. "I looked for you everywhere. I thought I'd never find you." Through flashbacks, we learn the truth about what happened to Max's family. After leaving him tied to the tree that fateful day, they had been involved in a terrible car accident on their way home. Her parents had died instantly, and she had spent months recovering in the hospital. By the time she was well enough to search for Max, he was nowhere to be found. She assumed he had wandered off or been taken in by someone else. Only recently, while visiting the town again, did she hear whispers about a loyal dog waiting under a tree in the park. Ethan arrived moments later, alerted by the commotion. He stood in the rain, watching the emotional reunion unfold. His heart swelled with happiness for Max but ached knowing he would have to say goodbye. The girl noticed Ethan and approached him hesitantly. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "For taking care of him when I couldn't." Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "He's always belonged with you," he replied simply. The storm began to subside as dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The rain had washed away the dirt and grime of the night, leaving everything fresh and new, including Max's life. After hours of crying, hugging, and whispering apologies, the girl, whose name was Lily, finally stood up. She gently tugged on Max's makeshift leash, which Ethan had replaced with a proper one before leaving them alone. "Come on, Max," Lily said softly, her voice filled with determination. "We're going home." Max hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at the park where he had spent so many lonely years. The tree where he had waited stood tall against the morning light, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was more than just a tree, it was a symbol of his loyalty, his hope, and his pain. But now, it was time to let go. With a final wag of his tail, Max turned and followed Lily to her car. As they drove away, Lily kept one hand on Max's head, stroking his fur reassuringly. "I promise I'll never leave you again," she murmured, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Max rested his chin on her lap, his tail thumping lightly against the seat. For the first time in 5 years, he felt safe. Back at the park, Ethan watched them leave from a distance. His heart ached, but it wasn't sadness he felt, it was relief. He knew Max belonged with Lily, no matter how much he had grown attached to the dog. Taking a deep breath, Ethan walked over to the tree where Max had waited so faithfully. The rope that had tethered Max to the tree lay coiled on the ground, abandoned. Ethan picked it up and held it tightly in his fist, feeling the weight of all those years of devotion. As he turned to leave, he noticed something glinting in the grass nearby. Bending down, he discovered an old dog tag half buried in the mud. It was Max's, his name engraved on the metal surface, along with a faded phone number. Ethan smiled faintly, pocketing the tag as a keepsake. Then, with one last glance at the empty space under the tree, he walked away, knowing Max's story had come full circle. Days later, Max found himself in a cozy house surrounded by familiar scents and sounds. Lily had redecorated her childhood home, filling it with photos of her family, including some of Max when he was younger. She made sure he had everything he needed, a warm bed, plenty of food, and toys to play with. But most importantly, she gave him love, the kind of unconditional love only a family could provide. One evening, as the sun set outside, Lily sat on the couch with Max curled up beside her. She flipped through an old photo album, showing him pictures of their past adventures together. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a snapshot of Max chasing after a frisbee in the park. Max barked happily, his tail wagging like crazy. Lily laughed, hugging him close. "You're my best friend, Max. Always have been, always will be." In that moment, Max seemed to understand. His eyes sparkled with happiness, free from the sadness that had haunted him for so long. He nuzzled Lily's arm affectionately, letting out a contented sigh. This was his home now, a place where he was loved and cherished. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of memories past. The tree in the park still stood, a silent witness to Max's incredible journey. Though Max would never return to it, its presence remained etched in his heart, a reminder of the loyalty and hope that had defined him. And so, Max's story ended not with sorrow, but with joy. He had waited 5 long years for his family, enduring loneliness, hunger, and heartbreak. But in the end, his faith had been rewarded. Love had found him again, proving that even in the darkest times, miracles can happen.